Sound check one. Good morning. Welcome to the Audit and Finance Committee. Just note that I will be stepping in for Chair Wang today. I know everybody's disappointed, but sometimes you just can't get what you want. We have quorum present. I'd like to call the meeting to order. All electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings, and we will move on to the approval of the agenda. Madam Clerk, any changes to the agenda?
Mr. Chair, although not a change to the agenda, we have a revised Appendix D that has been added to item 10.1. That's the 2024 mid-year budget adjustments, FCS 24047. The report and appendices A through C, however, remain unchanged.
Thank you, Clerk. May I please have a mover and seconder to approve the agenda as presented? Councillor Beattie, Councillor Clark. Any discussion? Seeing none, we'll go to the vote. And the vote is up. And that carries 6-0. Before I continue, I forgot to mention today, joining us virtually is Councillor Alex Wilson. In chambers, Councillor Maureen Wilson, Councillor Clark, Councillor Crutch, Councillor Beattie. And I think that's it, and myself. Declarations of interest, anyone? Good. Moving on to the approval of minutes of the previous meeting, which is item 4.1, October 3rd, 2024, 4.2, October 4th, 2024, special development charges hearing. May I please have a mover and seconder to approve the minutes of both those meetings? Councillor Beattie, Councillor Maureen Wilson. Okay. Any discussion? Seeing none, we'll go to the vote. And the vote is up. And that carries 6-0. Thank you. Moving on to discussion items. Item 10.1, 2024 mid-year budget adjustment, FCS 24047, citywide revised. May I please have a mover and seconder to put the report on the floor? Councillor Clark, Councillor Beattie. Any questions for staff? Councillor Maureen Wilson, please go ahead.
Thank you. I would appreciate just a brief overview, and then I do have a specific question thereafter. Thank you.
Perfect. GM Zagaric, please, or Director Weaver? Go ahead.
Through the chair, Mike Zagaric, General Manager, Finance Corporate Services. I'll start, then I'll invite Acting Director Weaver to provide any additional comments. The report that's before you recommends some routine budget adjustments that would be performed typically through our quarterly variance reporting. And again, in a typical year, but because of the cybersecurity incident and has resulted in disrupting the budget performance reporting that we would typically provide on a quarterly basis. And for that reason, staff are, through the budget adjustments report, recommending some budget adjustments that are permitted under the budget control, budgeted complement control, capital closing, capital budget appropriation, work in progress transfer, and general reserve policies. And again, those in part are laid out in Appendix A and B of the report that's before you. With respect to Appendix C, that as well includes the appropriations, and I believe there is just one appropriation that requires council approval as it exceeds the staff authority, the city manager authority of $250,000. With respect to Appendix D speaks to, committee may recall through the budget process that building faster funds, provincial funds, were included in the 2024 budget to reduce the overall levy impact. Appendix D sets out to accomplish that while meeting the provincial requirements of the program. The provincial requirements is that the funds be applied towards growth enabling capital projects. So staff have identified some capital projects that were previously approved by council such that the Building Faster funds can alleviate the impact on levy and rates according to the allocations that Council approved through the 2024 budget. So again, Appendix D satisfies both the provincial requirements as well as satisfying what Council approved through the 2024 budget processes for both the tax and the rate-supported budgets. And I'll invite Acting Director Weaver to add any additional comments.
Director.
Good morning, Kirk Weaver, Acting Director, Financial Planning, Administration and Policy. Through the chair, the only additional comment I'd make on Appendix D is that it reflects the investment plan that we were required to submit to the province. And once they approved that investment plan, we were able to make the allocations of the funding sources to the Building Faster Fund, freeing up the funds from various other sources that are noted in Appendix D. So it's reflective of the investment plan that we submitted for the BFF and that the province subsequently approved.
Thank you, Director. Councillor Wilson, please go ahead with your questions.
Thank you. Very appreciative of that overview. So just to make sure I understand it in real terms, if I am looking at Appendix D, I'm not picking this for any particular reason. I'm just picking the first project ID number, which is Eastwood Neighborhood. So the third column, bless you, identifies one source of funding as a federal gas tax. Then the municipality became in receipt of a provincial fund called the Building Faster Fund, which was specifically earmarked for growth related. And staff, in order to meet those fund parameters, switched up and therefore made more room. That's the part I'm not fully understanding, to apply the Building Faster Fund to this previously identified capital project. I guess my question, if I'm correct thus far, could you just help me understand what happens to that that federal gas tax portion that was originally applied? Through the chair.
GM Zagar?
Yeah, through the chair, in the case of the federal gas tax revenues, they will, as per our policy, they will be transferred back to the reserve to be used in future decisions, future years with respect to infrastructure projects.
Okay, thank you. So they're not that reserve amount has not been shifted to fund something else. It's being held and it goes back into reserve, which may or may not be used for a different capital project, correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Through the chair, that's correct. And that is being done to satisfy what council approved through the budget process, and that is to apply these funds to reduce both the water rate as well as the levy.
Thank you. I really appreciate that walkthrough.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Clark, please go ahead. And welcome to Councillor Mark Taddison as well.
Good morning, Vice Chair. If I can ask a couple of questions. Appendix A, it speaks of a temporary complement extension schedule. And so am I to infer from these documents that the FTEs that are there were all temporary FTEs on the left side of the form, and then on the right side, you're turning it into a 24-month extension? The challenge I'm having, it says transfer from this particular division to the very same division in the exact same spot. It's a little bit confusing.
Acting Director Weaver?
Through the chair, so that by policy, staff has delegated authority to have 24-month contract staff in place, and we require council approval to extend them. So in the case of it's not it may be something we can look improve the form. It's transferred from and transferred to. It's the same position. We're requesting council approval to extend it beyond for another 24 months at this point. So in many cases, it's the same position being extended beyond the original 24 months in delegated authority.
Thank you for that. It's not providing the rationale for the extension. So these were positions that were supposed to be temporary FTEs, and now they're being extended for another 24 months, so that would be 4 years of work. But I don't see a rationale as to why those contracts are being extended.
Jim Zagar?
Yeah. Through the chair, we can take those comments, understand those are appropriate comments in terms of understanding the rationale. For the purposes of this report, happy to take that away and provide that information before council and look at how we can amend this report in these appendices in the future to include a description of the rationale.
I would appreciate that. I'd like to be reminded as to what the original intention was for those temporary FTEs, what the project was, and why we're extending it. So how many years in total? To be fair to Mr. Zagarek, it perhaps was not contemplated in the form that is here, but we're really extending FTEs, which means we're extending costs that were supposed to be a temporary cost. It wasn't supposed to last forever. And I'm trying to understand the rationale. So if you could perhaps have that come back to us before council, I would like to understand that better.
Jim Zagar?
Through the chair, we will do so. We'll provide we'll work with the departments to provide the rationale for the request to extend. As well in the future, we'll look as to how we can amend this report to include that content.
Thank you. I have an ancillary question. It's not directly to this, but gapping. Do we get reports on the number of FTEs in the city that are empty and how those funds, budgeted funds, are being used as gapping to help pay for other funds, other programs?
I believe there's a report coming forward soon, Councillor Clark, but I'll let James Zagarek give us some more detail.
Through the chair, we do approve gapping. Just as a reminder, we approve gapping, I believe, somewhere in the area of $7 million through the 2024 budget. We have in the past, through our budget process, reported to council as to what transpired in year with respect to gapping and where we are trending with respect to gapping. That is information we are compiling. I don't know whether it will form part of our November outlook report. We are looking to bring a 2025 budget outlook in November. We are compiling the information, and we do know, for a variety of reasons, including the cyber incident and the restrictions that we faced to recruit because of the disruption of the cyber incident, that we have experienced some larger than typical gapping in 2024.
Thank you. I would like to have that information. And finally, can I ask, the cyber attack incident, whatever we're calling it, is it going to impact the timeliness of our budgeting approval process?
GM?
Yeah. To the chair, currently we're not anticipating that. We are later with respect to the outlook and budget schedule than we normally would be. As I mentioned, we are moving towards the November 6th GIC, and that is about 5 weeks later than in a typical year. Notwithstanding the the delay in as it relates to the Outlook report. We are still moving towards a rate budget presentation and approval, November and December, user fees in December, and a typical, not typical, I'll say a tax-supported budget schedule similar to 2024. So short answer is no, and we'll provide that schedule to Council for your consideration and approval on November 6th.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Not seeing anyone on the list. Just going to take one more look around. Okay, Clerk, do we have a mover and seconder? We do. Perfect. Let's vote to approve the recommendations in the report, please.
And just for a refresher, the mover and seconder are Councillor Clark and Councillor Beattie.
Thank you. Yes, Jeffrey Beattie.
Councillor Tattison, not to interrupt the frivolity, but Councillor Tattison, are you able to vote?
That carries 7-0. Thank you. Moving on to item 10.2, growth funding tools, reserve fund policy updates, FCS 24042 citywide. May I please have a mover and seconder to put the report on the floor? Councillor Tattison, Councillor Alex Wilson. Any questions for staff? Councillor Clark, please go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate the report on the reserves. I keep hearing Premier Doug Ford talking about municipalities having billions of dollars in reserves that they're not using. And that's why funding isn't necessarily flowing from the province to municipalities, because we have billions of dollars in reserves that we're not using. So for the public's use, can perhaps Mr. Zagaric indicate what are all these reserves used for? And can we use them as a rainy day fund for anything we want, or are they segregated funds that can only be used for certain specific things?
GM Zagaric.
Through the chair, I appreciate the question because it really does speak to the report that's before you and some housekeeping work that is captured in the report with respect to the development charge reserves, the community benefit charge reserve, and the establishment of a parkland acquisition reserve, which currently we did not have such a reserve policy. Sorry, we did not have such a policy. With respect to development charge reserves, these are what are referred to as obligatory reserves. And what obligatory reserves mean, they must be used for the purpose that the funds were collected. And as it relates to development charges, they are very prescribed. The legislation in the Act spells out how development charges are to be collected. For instance, if there is a large capital project or any capital project that supports growth, I'll use a wastewater treatment plant as an example, and if 60% of that expansion is attributed to growth, then the calculation starts with 60%, let's use a rough number, $100 million. So 60 million of that 100 million goes towards growth. And then there are further adjustments to that $60 million figure. And we get more granular in terms of within a particular component of that project, is there a benefit to growth or a benefit to existing? Is there any grant funding that's been received towards that project? What I'm really trying to highlight is it is very prescribed by legislation in terms, A, how development charges are collected. Then, as development occurs, as building permits are drawn, the developers are required to pay development charges. Those funds get apportioned to the appropriate reserves based on development charge, background study, and the development charge bylaw. Again, Those reserves are obligatory reserves under provincial legislation. We can only use those reserves to fund the projects that were identified through the work of the development charge background study and the associated bylaw to that background study. The report that's before you identifies some further legislative restrictions in that municipalities cannot use development charge reserves as an internal funding instrument. And we've done this on 2 limited occasions in the past, where rather than paying a higher cost to borrow externally, we borrow from the DC Reserve and we pay it back. Now the provincial government restricts municipalities. We are no longer able to use those reserves as an internal financing, so making it more restrictive and consequently clearly being able to demonstrate that those funds are going towards growth-related projects. If municipalities were to forego development charges, the consequence would be, or there could be a few consequences, is it could hamper or slow down our ability to facilitate growth. If we don't have the funds, then we're not able to make the necessary investments to facilitate growth, or we would have to replace the development charges with revenues from existing taxpayers and ratepayers. So yes, municipalities have development charge reserves. Yes, in some cases, those reserves are substantial, but they are being collected for the purpose of a growth-enabling project. And there seems to be some confusion in that there's an anticipation, there's some confusion in that some levels of governments are reviewing the reserve balances and assuming that as money comes in, money goes out. That's not the nature of development charges. Development charges are being collected from projects over, for instance, a 20-year span that have a growth-related capital project. And so consequently, the money may be collected, but the capital project may not be initiated for 5 years' time. So those funds sit in the reserve for those initial 5 years until the project is initiated, which comes to another point in the report. The provincial government now requires municipalities to report that at least 60% of the funds that are in these accounts are either spent or allocated. Back in September, we reported that we've satisfied those requirements with both our development charge reserves as well as our parkland acquisition reserve. So again, I appreciate the question because it does speak to the policy amendments, their housekeeping in the case of the development charge reserves, community benefit charge reserves, and that the provincial government has added some additional restrictions in terms of A, reporting, and B, is ensuring that the funds that are being collected are either spent or allocated for their intended purpose.
Thank you, GM Zagark, for that review. Councillor?
So to paraphrase, the development charges that are in these reserves were collected from development charges that were calculated based on the capital infrastructure and social infrastructure that's required for this new development to proceed. And that money will only be spent on that project. It's not free money that we can distribute anywhere we want, correct?
Through the chair, correct. I'll just point out that the social infrastructure, social housing was stricken from the Development Charge Act, so municipalities are no longer able to collect for social housing through development charges.
Councillor?
That seems ridiculous on the face of it, but I'll let that one go. The last question I have is this push from the federal government to freeze development charges in order for us to get access to funds from them. Do we have any idea what the impact will be to our reserves if we freeze DCs? So not taking it, if we freeze them, we're not increasing the number of development charges, the amount of the development charges that are allocated specifically for capital that's required for development. Then there's only one party left that can pay for that growth, and that would be the taxpayer.
GM?
Through the chair, the National Housing Infrastructure Fund does speak to for municipalities with a population greater than 300,000, the freezing of development charges for 3 years. That will require provincial legislative change to the Development Charge Act. In order for municipalities not to pass that on to existing taxpayers and ratepayers, the provincial government under the Act would have to empower municipalities not to essentially fund. Approximately in the case of Hamilton, we reported at the low end, I believe, $140 million over the 3 years, at the high end, $270 million over the 3 years. That would be a precedent that the provincial government would empower municipalities not to fund, not to collect funding associated with growth-related projects. Typically, those costs get borne by existing taxpayers and ratepayers. And so I don't expect an impact to reserves. I expect that if there is legislative change, it will be an impact to taxpayers and ratepayers, with the exception if senior levels of government offset those costs for municipalities.
Councillor?
Thank you. And I do appreciate all of the policies being attached to the document. This is an ancillary. Will we be reviewing our debt policy anytime in the near future? Or is that something that is required of council to pass a motion to have that staff direction?
Through the chair, we present the debt policy annually to council through a number of reports, including through the budget process. It is typically through our budget processes, both our water as well as our tax or levy process, where staff present a financing strategy that includes debt, and that would be the principal mechanism for council to affect either amending the policy or amending the financing strategy.
Thank you. I'll take the rest of that offline.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Up next, Councillor Maureen Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a single question for me, or maybe two, 1.5. Is another word for reserves deferred revenue? And is that, in accounting terms, is that a liability?
The bench is conferring.
Through the chair, I'm going to ask Lindsay Gillies to speak to development charges, recognizing they are deferred revenue, but maybe Lindsay can just further explain how they are a deferred revenue in the context of the city collecting those revenues pending an expenditure or a spend.
Lindsay, I apologize. I don't know your title, so if you could please introduce yourself and your title, please. Thank you.
Of course, thank you. So Lindsay Gillies, I'm the supervisor for development charges, programs, and policies here at the City of Hamilton. And thank you, Councillor Wilson, for your very technical question. So you are correct that some reserves by municipalities are considered a liability. So these obligatory reserves, which include the DC reserves, the CBC reserves, and the parkland dedication reserves that are in front of you today, those are all represent obligations to the municipality and therefore are presented as liabilities or deferred revenue on the balance sheet. What that means is that as soon as the money is collected, the municipality has a specific obligation to use those funds in specific ways, and that's why it appears as a liability.
Yeah, thank you.
Supervisor, you just made Councillor Wilson's day. You have half a question left.
Half a
Please,
question.
go ahead.
My other half a question is it at all our practice to pool those reserves with other municipalities in an effort to try and, while they're sitting there, because they have to be expended for the intended purpose of their collection, to try and perhaps perform better and bigger in the market? Through the chair.
GM Zager.
I think, through the chair, I think the councillor is referring to our investments and investment strategy in terms of those proceeds. Is that the question?
I'm just trying to understand. Thank you, Jim Zagaric. I don't purport to understand what I'm talking about, so let's not give me too much credit. But if we have reserves sitting in an account, it's earmarked for something, but while they're sitting waiting to be extended for the intentional purpose in which they were collected, is it at all the practice to invest them or pool them with other municipalities? That's my question.
Through the chair, short answer is yes. Through One Funds, which is a Municipal Finance Officers Association program where municipalities pool funds and they put them towards short-term and long-term investments. And that is the only mechanism I'm familiar with that enables municipalities to pool the proceeds for investment purposes.
So thank you. Just so I understand, do we do that? And is there a remarkable distinction between those funds that are pooled in terms of their performance versus those that are not? Through the chair.
Through the chair, we do participate in One Funds, and that One Funds allows for the provincial government has provided legislation for the investment into equity funds. So we do invest a relatively small portion of our investments through One Funds. We do report this through our annual investment performance report, and it is principally for that reason. It is a authority that the City of Hamilton does not have with respect to equity markets. But again, we do so within the guidelines Council has set out in terms of what portion of our investments can be invested into equity and into the equity markets.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Looking around to see if we have anybody that has any other questions. Seeing no one, we will go to the vote. That carries 7-0. Thank you. Moving on to 10.3, Community Benefits Charges Bylaw Amendment, FCS 24016. Mover and seconder to put the report on the floor. Councillor Crutch, Councillor Clark. Any questions for staff? Go ahead, Councillor.
I was looking at the appendix and I just didn't see a track changes version and wasn't able to find the other bylaw quickly enough. But is there an impact to us removing definitions in this bylaw? I think that's the only thing I noticed here that I was kind of like, well, you know, why are we doing that? Could someone maybe just explain briefly what that's about? I wasn't able to quickly find that information. In the future, if it's possible to provide track changes versions, that would always be really helpful so that we can just see how things are changing and being modified.
Director Weaver.
Through the chair, certainly we can provide track changes, probably provide track changes for committee following this meeting in time for council. Sorry, with respect to the question, the building permit definition, is that what you were referring to? The DC, the proposed change in the CBC bylaw is to align the definition of a building permit with what's in the development charges bylaw, so there's consistency. There's been some legislative change and changes in some of the planning documents since the CBC bylaw was originally approved, and so the proposed change is to bring it into alignment with what's in the DC bylaw.
Thanks. No, there was just sections you'd removed. So if you look at the Appendix A, it says 1, we remove definitions B and N. If you go down to 4, we remove without replacement section 13 of the bylaw. So just talking about the pieces, not that you've amended, which I think are clear here, but the pieces you're removing. Is it just to create synchronicity between these different documents, or is there some other reason why they were removed? That's all. I'm just trying to find out because I don't have the other version handy.
Supervisor?
Thank you. Again, Lindsay Gillies, Supervisor for Development Charges, Programs and Policy. So through the chair, the sections of the bylaw that are being removed are related to the downtown SEPA exemption. The downtown SEPA exemption within the CBC bylaw expired June 12th, 2024. And therefore, as we're looking to do some housekeeping amendments related to aligning this with legislation, staff are proposing to remove that redundant section now as well.
Thanks very much.
Looking around. Any other speakers? Seeing none, we will go to the vote. And that carries 7-0. Moving on to adjournment. Mover and seconder, Councillor Beattie, second by myself. Please indicate your vote.
Fails.
And that carries 7-0.